Story Ages of the Earth. Before the dinosaurs. Let's start the story. Everyone slept deeply as the time shuttle sped soundlessly on in time. When they landed, it would be late in the Devonian period, about 360 million years ago. Mike had won a prehistoric world tour for two in a competition. His sister Helen had not really wanted to come. She felt she was a bit old for dinosaurs. In fact, they had not seen a dinosaur yet, but they had come across other strange and terrifying creatures. The expedition was captained by Bob Marsh with Lieutenant Atkins as his second in command. Jenny Andrews was their space-time ranger. She knew almost as much about the prehistoric world as Timcom, the onboard computer, and she was a lot more fun. So far, they had only seen sea creatures because the earliest living things lived only in the water. The land was mostly bare and lifeless. Mike wanted to be the first to spot a real land animal, an amphibian. He thought he had seen one as they took off the day before. That fish thing we saw on the shore as we were taking off, Timcom, what was it? Asked Mike after breakfast. That was Eusthenopteran, a low-fin fish that could live out of water, said Timcom, putting a picture of it on the screen. Why would a fish want to live out of water? Said Helen. That seems silly to me. Well, with so many other creatures in the water, it might have been able to find more food on land, said Timcom. But how could it move and breathe? Asked Mike. Fish have no legs and no lungs. They die out of water. That's true of most fish, said Timcom. But even in our own time, there are some fish that can survive for a time in dried up ponds. They have evolved lungs as well as gills. They can also move about on their fins. A full-grown Eusthenopteron could probably not support its weight on land, but its young might, and on land they would be safe from all the big fish trying to eat them. So that's another reason for a fish to move onto the land. We are about to land ourselves, said Ginny. Still, not many plants, said Helen. As the shuttle touched down, the hills are all bare. There are a lot of more than there, said Jenny. I can't wait to go and have a look at all that greenery by the stream and see if there are any amphibians. You will have to wire life support source again, said Captain March, just in case the air is not pure enough for you to breathe. And don't be too long. This is only a short stop. We have got a lot more to do today. Jenny, Mike, and Helen climbed into their spacesuits and set off along the course of the nearby stream. The water was full of fish, and for the first time there were creepy crawlies on the ground and plants with stems. They had walked more than a mile when Jenny let out a cry of delight, which the other heard over the intercom. Look, she said. Spawn! In the water was a clump of black spotted jelly, just like frogs' eggs, but bigger. There were also some things like new tadpoles with frilly gills on their heads. Whatever laid those eggs must be around somewhere. Move carefully. We don't want to frighten it, said Jenny. Can you sense where it is, Timcom? she asked the all-knowing computer. No, but I can tell you that the spawn belongs to Ichthyos tiger, the first amphibian we know about. Look for a sheltered place near the water. That's where it will be. And that's where they found it, just crawling out from under a rock. It was green and spotted and about a yard long. They watched the creature until Timcom said it was time to go back. As they walked, Jenny instructed Timcom to photograph certain plants. She explained to the other that nobody knew much about early prehistoric plants. They were too fragile to have fossiled easily. Helen and Mike were not terribly interested in the plants. They wanted their lunch and hurried on ahead. Suddenly, they stopped. "What on earth is that?" shrieked Mike. Across their path crawled a millipede that seemed to go on forever. It was huge. "It's like an endless train. Look at all its legs," said Jenny, catching up with them. "It must be 6 feet long." "One of the larger millipedes," said Timcom. "Its ancestors probably left the water before the fish. Their bodies didn't have to adapt very much for life and on land, and they eat plants, so there is plenty of food for them." "It would make a big enough lunch for us all," said Mike. "Oh," said Jenny, "all right for an amphibian like Ichthyostega, but not for me." After they had eaten lunch, squeezed out of a tube as usual, they got ready to move on the Carboniferous period, a short hop of 20 million years. Now that there was life on land, they had to make sure that they didn't accidentally take any insects or larger creatures with them, for fear of upsetting the balance of nature. After they had checked the shuttle, they took off into Earth orbit and then went into the time mode. As usual, everything went eerily black outside. Jenny and Helen picked up their books, and Mike had a few words with Timcom. "Was Ichthyostega the first land animal?" he asked. "No," said the computer. "That millipede's ancestors probably lived on land long before amphibians evolved. The first land creatures had to rely on plants for food. Amphibians don't eat plants, so they couldn't have evolved until there were enough other creatures for them to eat. It took millions of years. Ichthyostega lived on land, but it had to go back to the water to lay its eggs. And it was tied to the water anyway because of its skin." "What was wrong with its skin?" asked Mike, peering at the picture on the screen. "It wasn't waterproof," said Timcom. "Land animals need waterproof skins to stop their bodies from drying out. That's why you can find amphibians only in damp places." They all got a surprise when they came into land in the Carboniferous period. Everywhere was green, with vast forests and swamps. It was hard to find a place to land. "Be careful when you go out," said Captain Marsh. "The land is often very swampy. Stick to the rocks or place where there are tall trees growing. Wear your lesion-proof undersuits in case you get bitten. There's no need for life support suits anymore. Timcom has tested the air and it's fine." "I think I might stay here and finish my book," said Helen. She didn't like the sound of being bitten. "Come on, Helen," said Mike. It won't be any fun without you, and I need you to hold my hand." "Look at the plants," said Jenny as they walked along. "We'll get Timcom to tell us about them when we get back," she added, to stop Timcom from launching into a speech. It was difficult to avoid looking at the plants. Some of them were 100 feet tall, and they were so thick that the sun could barely penetrate them. In the eerie half light, they could hear insects buzzing and water lapping. Pushing their way toward the light, they came to a clear pool, full of long, thin, withering creatures. "Snakes!" said Mike. "No," said Timcom through the intercom. "More amphibians. Snakes are reptiles. Creatures that evolved from amphibians. You won't see reptiles yet." They watched the creatures for a while, and then made their way around the pond. A huge dragonfly skimmed across the surface. It was beautiful, but scary. The ground by the pond was a bit soft, so they headed back to the higher, firmer ground. The air was thick with insects. They pinched against the visors of their helmets. "Thank heavens for the helmets," thought Helen. Suddenly, Mike screamed again. This time, he had been the first to spot a giant scorpion. It was just by Helen's hand, and the poisonous sting in its tail glistened. "I don't like this," said Helen, and she took to her heels. She ran as fast as she could, but the dense undergrowth made speed impossible. She looked back and saw Jenny and Mike, examining the scorpion as though it were a kitten. As she did so, she tripped and fell into the undergrowth. The fronds of a huge fern closed over her. She scrambled to her feet and tried to push the plants away. Ahead of her there was a clear patch of ground. If only she could reach it. She stumbled on and suddenly felt something hit her helmet. She put her hand up to move what she took to be a plant stem, but it wasn't. It was a thread of silk. Looking up, Helen saw that she had stumbled into the lair of a huge, hairy spider. The spider had come out to see what it had caught. Helen backed away and screamed. She had always been scared of spiders, and this one was almost a yard wide. Frozen to the spot, she screamed again. Jenny and Mike were miles away. There was nothing she could do but scream. She had forgotten that Timcom could hear her. The computer had, of course, sounded the alarm immediately, located her, and sent Bob and Attie to help. They arrived to find her still rooted to the spot. Jenny and Mike, having heard the excitement, had hurried to find her as well. "Gosh," said Mike, "what a beauty!" He and Jenny set about examining the spider and getting its vital statistics from Timcom. "I think it's time we gave up for today," said Bob. "It's getting dark, and I don't suppose you'd like to spend the night in the forest, would you?" "But we haven't seen everything," pleaded Mike. "I've seen quite enough," said Helen. "Well, you can stay out for a bit longer, but stay together." Helen should not have been felt alone. "Well, I wasn't quite alone, was I?" said Helen. "Thanks for saving me, Timcom." "You didn't need saving," said Timcom. "Spiders don't eat people, and even the scorpion couldn't pierce your suit." After supper, Jenny, Bob, and Helen played cards. Attie updated the log And Mike, as usual, asked Timcom about all the things they had seen. Next morning, he told everyone about the plants and trees they had seen: giant ferns, horsetails, and club mosses. Etty put the shuttle into the hover mode and took them on an early morning tour for the forest. Much of the land was flooded. Trees were uprooted and lying half submerged. "What's happening?" Mike asked Timcom. "What are you looking at? It is a coal swamp," said Timcom. "The trees that fall gradually sink into the mud and decay. Eventually, they will turn into—" "Coal," interrupted Helen. She had studied coal at school and liked to show Mike that she knew a thing or two. "How do they turn into coal?" asked Mike. Helen left the explaining to Timcom. "Millions and millions of trees like these died during Carboniferous times, when the land was flooded," said the computer. "Their remains built up in thick layers and formed pit. New plants grew on top of the pit. Then, maybe thousands of years later, the sea flooded the land again. The dumped mud and sand on top of the pit. This heavy weight squeezed the pit until it was almost rock hard. In fact, until it became coal. The coal people burn today is the remains of those giant trees." "Think of that," said Jenny. "When you see coal burning, it was all alive once. Even Helen's spider is now coal." After they had looked at the surface for a while, they found a large area of land that had not been flooded. The plants were flourishing and the sun was high. Jenny and Mike were eager to go out and explore, but it took half an hour to persuade Helen to venture outside again, and even then she would only go with a stun gun to protect herself. They stuck to the high ground, but there was not much to see. So they edged their way down to the shore of a lake and watched the dragonflies. Then they noticed a huge animal on the bank opposite. The creature heaved its way over the ground and slid into the water to catch a fish. "This must be a reptile," thought Mike. "It's at least 15 feet long and it looks like a crocodile." But it wasn't a reptile, it was another amphibian called Eugeirinus. Jenny really wanted to see a reptile. Reptiles first lived in Carboniferous times, but not many of their fossils have been found. She would have loved to have found a living one to film, or even to have discovered some reptile eggs. They watched Eugeirinus for a while, and then Mike noticed another smaller creature. "That could be a reptile," he said. "It's much enough." "Where?" asked Jenny, stepping towards the fallen tree that Mike was pointing at. The little animal was sheltering under it. "It's there," he said, "right at the end." Jenny edges along the trunk, leaning over to try to glimpse the animal. But the trunk could not bear her weight. It tipped up and sank into the swampy edge of the lake. Jenny toppled after it and began to sink. Mike ran toward her, but Helen screamed to him to stop. "Throw something she can hang on to. There's no point in falling in yourself." There was a tree fern bending over the swamp. It bent even more under Mike's weight. as he climbed along it, but he still could not reach Jenny, who was up to her chest in the mud. "Hold on, Jenny!" He shinned down the tree and took off his suit. Then he climbed the tree again and tied the arms of his suit around the trunk so that Jenny was able to catch hold of the legs. But she still could not move. She was safe only as long as the suit and the tree held. "Stay here. I'm going for others," said Helen. "Timcom obviously can't hear what's happened." Helen rushed headlong back the way they had come, leaping over plants and brushing aside the insects and spider in her path. Twice she fell and picked herself up. She must find Bob and Attie. Suppose they were not here. Suppose they were not there. Suppose the shuttle wasn't there. Timcom wasn't working, so anything could have happened. Helen ran on and on, imagining all the worst things that could happen. Then a dreadful thing did happen. A huge armed animal was blocking her path. It was too big to leap over or get around. It had come out from under an overhanging rock to eat the leaf litter. Its chomping jaws were making a dreadful noise. She threw a piece of rock at the creatures, but it would not shift itself. She had dropped her stun gun long before. There was nothing else to do. She would have to climb over it. She worked gingerly toward it, and suddenly it saw her. She froze, but instead of spitting poison at her as she feared it might, it moved slowly back under the ledge. Helen could still see it as she edged past. It made her feel quite sick, but the thought of Mike and Jenny kept her going. She hurtled towards the shuttle, and there at last were Bob and Attie, hurrying to her with a rope. "Of course, Timcom did not break down," said Bob. "It transmitted an alarm as soon as Jenny fell, and we have Timcom's pictures. None of you thought to say what had happened." "We were too busy," said Helen. "Come on, let's hurry. Look out for that great big thing there," she said, as they came up to the creature. Was this the same Helen who was made the spider the previous day? Bob and Attie could not believe their ears. Soon they reached the swamp. Jenny was still hanging for dear life, and Mike was still holding down the tree. Both of them were waiting for the terrible ripping sound of its roots being torn out of the ground. To them, it seemed ages since Helen had gone. In reality, it was only minutes. Jenny had bravely been explaining to Mike that the little creature was not a reptile, but an amphibian called Microbrachius. "It's my fault," she said. "I should have known that a reptile would not have been hiding from the sun. They love the warmth." Attie and Bob threw Jenny and the rope and pulled her out. "You are my fine one to be a ranger," said Bob, hugging Jenny. "You are supposed to stop the others from doing foolish things." Helen held Mike down from the tree, and they all headed back to the shuttle. Suddenly, Mike screamed, "Look at that!" and pointed at the creature, who was once more blocking the path. It was, according to Jenny, who was as enthusiastic as ever despite her ordeal, an arthropleuroid, an extinct creeper that lived on the forest floor. "Oh, don't worry about that old thing," said Helen, as they crept past. "It won't hurt you." Story: The Secret Garden. The story is telling about a girl. Let's see what's happening in the story. Mary Lennox. Mary Lennox was a spoiled, rude, and bad-tempered child. She was never really well, and she was thin, miserable, and sour-faced. No one liked her at all. None of this was really Mary's own fault. She was born in India, where her father worked. He was always busy with his work and paid no attention to his daughter. Her mother was very pretty and cared only for parties and pleasure. She felt Mary in the care of an Indian nursemaid who gave the little girl everything she wanted so that she would not cry and upset her mother. So, not surprisingly, Mary grew up into a spoiled and most unpleasant girl. One hot morning, when Mary was 9 years old, she had a strange feeling that something was wrong. From her room, she heard shouts and cries and the patter of hurrying feet. But no one came to her. She lay back on her bed and fell asleep. When she awoke, the house was silent. Still, no one came to her, and she was angry that she had been forgotten. Suddenly, the door opened, and 2 Englishmen came in. "Why was I forgotten?" Mary asked, stamping her foot. "Why does nobody come?" "Poor little kid," said one of the men. "There's nobody left to come." That was how Mary learned that her father and mother had been killed by a disease sweeping the country. The servants had died, too. Mary was alone. There was no one in India to look after her, so she was sent all the way to England to live with her uncle, Mr. Craven, at Misselthwaite Manor in Warwickshire. In London, Mary was met by Mrs. Medlock, her uncle's housekeeper. Mary disliked her at once, but then Mary disliked everyone. Mrs. Medlock thought Mary was a plain, rude child, and she was quite right. As they travelled north, she told Mary about the house. It sounded very grand and gloomy, and stood on the edge of a moor. "There will be nothing for you to do, and your uncle won't bother with you," said Mrs. Medlock. "He's got a crooked back. He was a sour young man until he married. His wife was very pretty, and he worshipped her. When she died, it made him more strange than ever. He's away most of the time, so you will have to look after yourself." It was dark when they got out of the train. A carriage took them to the house, but Mary could see nothing outside in the rainy blackness. "Where's the moor like?" she asked. "It's just miles and miles of wild land," replied Medlock. "Nothing grows there but gorse and heather, and nothing lives on it but wild ponies and sheep." At last the carriage stopped in a courtyard. A butler opened a huge oak door. "You're to take her to her room," he said to Mrs. Medlock. "The master is going to London tomorrow, and he doesn't want to see her." Mary followed Mrs. Medlock upstairs, and through many corridors to a room with a fire burning and supper on the table. "This is where you will live," Mrs. Medlock told Mary. "Just see you stay here and don't go poking around and the rest of the house." This was Mary's welcome to Misselthwaite Manor. It made her feel cross and unwanted and lonely. The Gardens. The next morning, Mary awakened to find a housemaid lighting her fire. She was called Martha, and she chatted as she worked. Mary was not used to friendly servants. In India, she had never said please or thank you, and once she had slapped her nurse's face when she was angry. Somehow, she knew that she must not treat Martha this way. At first, Mary had no interest in Martha's chatter, but little by little, she began to listen to the friendly Berkshire voice. You should see all my brothers and sisters in our little cottage on the moor," Martha said. "There's 12 of us, and my father only gets 16 shillings a week. My mother has a job to feed, all for that. The fresh air on the moor makes them strong and healthy. Our deacon, he's 12. He's always out on the moor. He's good with animals. He's tamed a wild pony." When Martha left, Mary went out to play. "Go and look at the gardens," Martha had said. "There's not much growing now, but it's lovely in summers." She had stopped for a second and then said softly, "One garden has been shut up for 10 years, ever since Mrs. Craven died." Mr. Craven locked the door and buried the key. He hated this garden. The grounds of Misselthwaite Manor were huge. They were divided by high walls, so there were many gardens. In some there were flowers and trees and fountains. Vegetables grew in others. Doors led from one garden to the next, and every garden looked bare and wintry. Presently, an old man came through one of the doors. He had a surly old face and did not seem at all pleased to see Mary. In the picture, we can see Mary and the man who was working in the garden. Let's see what's happening here. "Can I go through the door?" asked Mary. "If thou likes," he replied. "There's naught to see." Mary was hoping to find the door to the locked garden. She tried many doors, but they all opened easily. There was one wall covered with ivy that seemed to have no door at all. She could see trees behind the wall. A robin on a high branch burst into song. She stopped to listen, and the cheerful notes brought a little smile to her unhappy face. She wandered back to the old man, who ignored her and went on digging. At last she said, "There's a garden over there without a door." "What garden?" he asked gruffly. "On the other side of that wall," she replied. "I heard a robin in the trees there." The old man stood up, and smile spread across his face. Mary saw how much nicer he looked when he smiled. He whistled very softly. The robin landed by the man's foot. "Here he is," he said quietly. "He always comes when I whistle. Isn't he a grand little chap? Look, he knows we're talking about him. The robin, plump and scarlet-breasted." hopped about, pecking at the earth. Ben Whirlstaff, the gardener, went on digging. "He is the only friend I've got," he said. "When he is not with me, I'm lonely." "I'm lonely too," said Mary. "I've never had any friends." Ben stopped and looked at her. "I reckon we're a good bit alike," he said. "We're not good looking and we're as sour as we look." Mary had never thought before about the sour face of bad temper. Now that she did, it made her feel uncomfortable. Just then, the robin flew up into a tree and sang with all his voice. "He's taken a fancy to thee," said Ben. "He wants to be your friend." Mary looked up at the robin. "Would you be my friend?" she asked. She spoke softly and kindly, instead of in her usual hard little voice. "Why?" said Ben, gently. They said that like a real child instead of a sharp old woman. It was nearly like Dickon when he talks to the wild things on the moor. The robin flew over the wall. "There must be a door to that garden," Mary said with determination. "Well, there's none to be found now," snapped Ben. "Don't go poking your nose in places where you don't belong." And he walked off without saying goodbye. In the picture, we see Mary and Martha. They were talking. Let's see what's happening here. Robin shows the way. Mary spent most days out of doors. The cold wind brought a pink glow to her cheeks, and each evening she ate a good meal. After supper, she liked to sit by the fire and talk to Martha. "Why does Mr. Craven hate the log garden?" Mary asked one evening. "It was Mrs. Craven's garden. She loved it," Martha said. "She was sitting on the branch of a tree when it broke, and she fell. She was hurt so bad she died. That's why he hates it. He won't let any more talk about it." Mary had never felt sorry for anyone before, but now she understood how very unhappy Mrs. Craven must be. The wind blew across the moor and moaned and roared around the house. Martha called it woodhane. Mary listened, and through the woodhane she thought she heard a child crying. "No," Martha said, when Mary asked. "It's only the wind of the scullery maid. She's been crying all day with toothache." And she quickly left the room. Next day, the rain poured down. "On a day like this at home," said Martha, "we all try to keep busy indoors, except Dickon. He goes out in all weathers. He brought home a fox cub that he found half drowned. He's got a crow too, called Snoot." Left on her own, Mary decided to explore the house. She went down corridors and up and down stairs. In the stillness, she heard again the faint sound of a child crying. As she stopped to listen at a door, another door opened and out came Mrs. Medlock. "What are you doing here?" she demanded. "Get back to your room at once." Mary was angry. She knew that she had heard the cry, and she meant to find out what it was. The storms passed. Wait until the sun shines on the golden gorse and the heather, said Martha. I'd like to see your cottage on the moor and meet your mother, said Mary. The would love my mother, Martha said. She's kind and loving and hard-working. When it's my day out and I can go home to see her, I just jump for joy. I'd like to see Deacon too, said Mary. Yes, you'd like him, Martha said. Everyone likes Deacon. No one likes me, said Mary sadly. Well, maybe that's because you don't like other people, said Martha, smiling. I never thought of that, said Mary. Mary found Ben in the garden. Now in the picture we see Mary and the robin. And Mary found something on the earth. Let's see what's happening here. Spring coming, he said. The plants are working under the swell. You will soon see crocuses and daffodils. The robin flew over and Mary followed him to his perch on the ivy-covered wall. He hopped down onto the swell and, as Mary came nearer, he pecked at the earth for a worm. Suddenly, in the swell, Mary saw a rusty key. Perhaps it's the key to the secret garden, she thought, slipping it into her pocket. After supper, Martha told Mary about her day at home. Mother has sent you a present to cheer you up. She brought out a skipping rope with striped handles and showed Mary how to skip. Your mother is very kind, said Mary, wondering how Martha's mother could have spared the money to buy her a rope. Now, wherever she went, Mary skipped, and the more she skipped, the stronger she grew. Deacon. One morning, Mary was watching the robin on his perch on the wall, when suddenly something happened that felt like magic. A gust of wind blew the ivy on the wall, and under the leaves Mary saw a door. She felt for the key in her pocket and tried it in the lock. It was very stiff, but she could just turn it. The next second, she was in the secret garden. Mary's heart thumped as she looked round. It was overgrown and untidy, but she thought it was the loveliest place. She saw green shoots of bulbs pushing up through the swell, and she pulled the weeds away to make room for the crocuses and snowdrops. Time slipped by as she went on weeding and clearing dead leaves and grass. At supper time, she longed to share her secret with Martha, but she dared not in case she should be forbidden to go again to her secret garden. Instead, she said, I wish I had a bit of a garden to grow things in. That's a lovely idea, said Martha. I'll get Deacon to bring some garden tools and seeds to plant. Mary worked with her hands in her secret garden every day. She was careful that Ben Weatherstaff never saw where she went. One day, Ben said to her, This fresh air is doing 3 good. That's fatter and not so yellow. They looked like a young plucked crow when they first came. Mary laughed. She even liked Ben on his grumpy days. One day, Mary saw a boy sitting under a tree. 2 rabbits and a pigeon were near him, and a squirrel clung to the tree above his head. They all seemed to be listening to the tune he was playing on a pipe. Now in the picture we see Mary and Deacon. She let him do through the door. Let's see what's happening in the story in here in the garden. The boy got up slowly so as not to frighten the animals. His blue eyes smiled from his round, rosy face. "I'm Deacon," he said to Mary. "I brought the garden tools and some flower seeds." His smile was so gentle and kind that Mary forgot to be shy. She felt that if animals trusted him, she could trust him too. After a while, she asked, "Do you know about the secret garden?" "I've heard of it," he said, "but I don't know where it is." Making sure no one was watching, Mary led him through the door in the wall. Deacon was amazed. He looked around at all the plants and trees. "All these will grow," he said. "There will be flowers and roses everywhere in a few weeks." They worked together, weeding and pruning. Mary felt she had never known anyone like Deacon. Trying to speak in a warm, work-sharp voice like Deacon's and Martha's, she asked, "Does they like me?" And he laughed. "That does, and so does the robin." After dinner, Mrs. Medlock came to take Mary to see Mr. Craven. "He's going away tomorrow, and he wants to see you first," she said. Mary felt a little afraid and very awkward and stiff. But Mr. Craven wasn't a bit frightening, nor was his back really crooked. His face was handsome, but looked full of worry and misery. He asked if there was anything she would like. Mary asked for a piece of garden to grow her own flowers. "Of course," said her uncle. "Take any bead that's not being used." Mary knew which bead this would be. She could call the secret garden her own. Calling. In the night, Mary was awakened by heavy rain and the withering of the wind. She couldn't sleep, and she lay tossing in bed. She heard the crying again. "There's never the wind," she whispered. "I don't care what Mrs. Medlock says. I'm going to find out what that noise is." Candlestick in hand, she walked softly along the corridors. She saw a light shining under a door. She pushed the door open, and there, lying on a four-poster bed, she saw a boy crying pitifully. He turned suddenly and stopped crying. "Are you a ghost?" he asked, frightened. "No, I'm Mary Lennox," she answered. "Who are you?" "I am Mr. Craven's son, Colin," said the boy. "So I must be your cousin," said Mary. "Did no one tell you I would come to live here?" "No, no one would dare," replied Colin. "I should have been afraid you'd see me. My father won't let people see me. He's afraid I'll grow up to be a hunchback. I'm always ill, so I stay here in bed. My father hates me because my father died when I was born." "Have you always been here?" asked Mary. "Nearly always," replied Colin. "If I go out, people stare at me and I can't stand it." "If you don't like people to see you," Mary said, "shall I go away?" "Oh, no," Colin answered quickly. "Stay and talk to me." Mary sat on a cushioned stool next to the bed, and they talked for a long time. Colin wanted to know all about Mary, and she answered all his questions. He told her how miserable and lonely he felt, even though he was given whatever he asked for. All the servants have to please me, Colin said. It makes me ill to be angry, so everyone has to do as I say. Do you think you will get well? Mary asked. I don't suppose I shall, Colin replied. I think I'm going to die. But let's talk about something else. How old are you? I'm 10, same as you, Mary said. How do you know I'm 10? He asked. Because the garden was locked 10 years ago, when you were born, Mary answered. What garden? Colin asked, surprised. Just a garden Mr. Craven hates, Mary replied. He locked the door and buried the key. Where's the garden like? Colin persisted. No one has been allowed to see it for 10 years, Mary answered. She was careful not to let him know that she had already found it. Colin wanted to know all he could about the garden, and they talked about the exciting things they might find there. I shall make them open the door, Colin said. Oh no, cried Mary. Let's keep it a secret. If they open the door, it will never be a secret again. Perhaps one day we may find the door. We could go inside and no one would know about it but us. I should like that, said Colin. I never had a secret before. Tired from talking, he fell asleep and Mary crept away. In the picture, we see Mary and Martha was talking about something. Let's see what's happening. Rainy days. The next morning, Mary told Martha about the crying and how she had found Colin. Poor Martha was very upset. She thought she might lose her job for allowing Mary to find the young master of the house. You needn't worry, Mary told her. Colin was pleased and he wants to see me every day. They must have bewitched him, Martha cried. What's the matter with him? Mary asked. Martha told her that since he was born, Colin had not been allowed to walk. His father thought his back was weak. A famous doctor had been to see him and had said he would get strong if less fuss was made of him. But still he was spoiled and given his own way. Colin thinks he will die, said Mary. Do you think so? Mother says there's no reason for a child to live if he can't get out in the fresh air, Martha replied. It's done me good to be outside, said Mary. Do you think it would help Colin? I don't know, Martha said. He had a bad tantrum when he was taken into the garden. He got angry because he thought one of the gardeners was looking at him. He cried so much he was ill all night. Well, said Mary, if he ever gets angry with me, I shan't go to see him again. On our next visit to Colin, Mary told him about Deacon. He's not like anyone else, she said. He can charm the animals on the moor. When he plays his pipe, they come to listen. The moor sounds a wonderful place. And Colin, but I will never see it. I'm going to die. How do you know? Mary asked, feeling a little cross. Colin talked about dying almost as though it pleased him. Everyone says I will, Colin replied. I think my father will be glad when I'm not here. I don't believe that, said Mary. That famous doctor was right. They should make less fuss of you, and they should let you go out. If you could only see Deacon, you'd want to get well. And she told him all about Deacon's family, who were so well and happy, even though they were so poor. It rained for a week, so Mary could not visit the garden. Instead, she spent her days with Colin. They read and talked, and for the first time, Colin started to love. He often spoke of the garden and what might be in it. Mary longed to share her secret with him, but felt that she could not yet trust him. In the picture, we see Mary was breathless with happiness. Mary is breathless with happiness with her cousin. The secret is told. After the rain, Mary awoke early one morning to find the sun streaming through the blinds. When she ran down to the secret garden, she found that Deacon was already there. "I couldn't stay in bed on a morning like this," he cried. "Look at the garden." The rain and the warmth had made all the new shoots push up through the earth. There were clumps of orange and purple crocuses. Mary was breathless with happiness. The robin was building a nest. He mustn't watch too close, warned the cat. He's too busy now for visiting and gossiping. A whole week had passed since Mary had last seen Deacon. She told him about finding Colin. "If we could get him out here," said Deacon, "he would forget about lumps growing on his back. He would be just 2 layers and a little less looking on at the springtime. It would do him more good than doctor stuff." When Mary went in at the end of the day, Martha told her that Colin was angry because she had not been to see him. "I won't let that boy come if you stay with him instead of me." Colin raged when Mary went to see him. "You're selfish for not coming." "What are you?" snapped Mary. "You are the most selfish person I know." "Well, I'm going to die," wailed Colin. "I don't believe it," said Mary sourly. "You only want people to be sorry for you. But they're not. You are too nasty." She marched to the door and called back. "I was going to tell you about Deacon and his fox and crow, but I shan't now." And she shut the door firmly behind her. Later, as she thought of Colin's lonely day, her anger faded, and she felt sorry for him. "If he wants to see me tomorrow," she thought, "I will and sit with him." In the night, Mary was awakened by noises in the corridor, and she could hear sobbing and screaming. "It's Colin having a tantrum," she thought. She covered her ears, but she couldn't shut out the dreadful sounds. She jumped out of bed and stamped her foot angrily. "Somebody must stop him," she cried. He deserves a beating for being so selfish. He's upsetting everyone in the house." She ran into Colin's room and shouted, "Stop! I hate you!" "You'll scream yourself to death in a minute, and I wish you would." Colin looked dreadful. His face was swollen and he was grasping and choking. But Mary was too angry to care. "If you scream again, I shall scream louder," she stormed. In the picture, we see that Mary and Colin here, maybe Colin is sick, and she's trying to see him what's happening actually. Okay, let's see what's happening in the story. "I can't stop," sobbed Colin. "I felt a lump coming on my back." "Turn over and let me look," Mary ordered. She looked carefully at the poor, thin back. "There's not a lump as big as a pin," she announced. Don't you ever talk about it again." Colin's sobbing slowly died, and Mary sat by his bed quietly and comforting him until he fell asleep. In the morning, Mary found Deacon in the garden with his squirrels, and she told him of Colin's sobbing in the night. "Oh, he mum get him out here, poor lad," said Deacon. "Aye, that way, mum," said Mary, using the same Yorkshire words Deacon loved. "Damon talk a bit on. Work sure to Colin," he said. "It'll make him laugh, and mother says laughing's good for ill folk." When Mary went to see Colin, she told him about Deacon and his squirrels. Nut and Shell. They laughed and talked for a long time. Then Colin said, "I'm sorry that I said I would send Deacon away. I didn't mean it. He sounds like a wonderful boy." "I'm glad you said that," said Mary, "because he's coming to see you, and he's bringing his animals." Colin cheered up. He looked so happy that Mary suddenly decided to take a chance. "That's not all," she said. There's something better. I found the door to the garden." Colin was overjoyed. "Then shall we go in and find out what's inside?" he asked. Mary paused, and then boldly told the truth. "I've already been in it. That's why I could tell you so much about it. I didn't dare tell you on my secret until I was sure I could trust you. I shall live forever and ever." At breakfast, Colin announced to his nurse, "A boy and some animals are coming to see me. Bring them straight up when they arrive." It wasn't long before Mary heard a bleating. "There's Deacon's lamb," she cried. "They're coming." Deacon came in smiling. He carried a lamb, and his little fox trotted beside him. Nut the squirrel sat on the shoulder, and Soot the crow on the other. His other squirrel, Shell, peeped out of a pocket. Colin stared in wonder. Deacon gently put the lamb in Colin's lap and gave him a bottle to feed it. They were all so busy and happy together. In the picture also we can see Mary, Colin and Deacon. Let's see what's happening here. "I'm going to see it all," cried Colin. "Aye, that the mum," said Mary, and the Manette lose no time about it. Colin was put in his chair, and Deacon pushed it along the paths. As they went, Mary told Colin about the places they passed. "Here's where I met Ben," she said, "and this is where I saw the robin. And this," she whispered, "this is the garden." Mary opened the door, and Deacon pushed the chair inside quickly. Colin looked around for a long time, seeing all things Mary had described. Then he cried out, "I shall get well. I shall live forever and ever." That afternoon, the whole world changed for Colin. "It's been a grand day," said Deacon. "Aye, that it has," said Mary. "Does the thing that," said Colin, "that it was made like this, you're all for me?" "My word," said Mary. "That's a good bit of Yorkshire," and they all joined in the laughter. "I don't want this day to go," said Colin. but I shall come back every day." "That the will," said Deacon, "and we shall soon have the digging and walking." Suddenly, Ben Weatherstaff's face glared down at them from the top of the wall. "What are you doing in there?" he shouted at Mary. Then he saw Colin and his mouth opened in surprise. "Do you know who I am?" Colin asked. "Aye, that I do," Ben answered. "That are the poor crippled lad." Colin sat up angrily. "I'm not a cripple." "I'll show you," he cried. He struggled out of the chair and with Deacon's help stood straight and tall. "Look at me now," he shouted. "God bless thee, lad," said Ben, and tears ran down his face. Colin remained standing. He suddenly felt his fear leave him. "I'm not afraid any more," he cried. "It's the magic of the secret garden. It's working to make all the plants grow, and it will work for me." That evening, Colin was quiet. After a long time, he said to Mary, I'm not going to be a poor thing anymore. If I believe, I shall get strong and well. The magic will make it happen." Magic. Next day in the garden, Colin called Mary, Deacon, and Ben to him. "I'm going to show you that the magic works," he said. Slowly, taking a few steps at a time, Colin walked right round the garden. His face was flushed with joy. "This must be the biggest secret of all," he said. "When I can walk and run well, I shall walk into my father's study and say, 'Here I am, well and strong.'" It was very hard to keep the secret. The magic of the secret garden was making Colin bright-eyed and rosy-cheeked. Each day, Colin and Mary did exercises to make them strong, and they both grew plumper and healthier. Mary became pretty, and Colin no longer looked like an invalid. Everyone was amazed at the change. Now, while the secret garden was working its magic, Mr. Craven was traveling in faraway places. For 10 years he had been trying to run away from his sorrow and had refused to be comforted. Then one day, whilst working in Australia, he sat down by a stream. Gradually, he felt his mind and body relax. The peace of the place filled him, and from that moment, he felt healthier and happier. One night, he dreamed of his wife's garden at Misselthwaite Manor. The dream was so clear that he decided to return home at once. As soon as he arrived home, he went to the garden. He worked slowly as all his sad memories came rushing back. As he stood by the door of the secret garden, wondering how to find the key, he heard laughter coming from the other side of the wall. Now in the picture we see Father Craven and his son Colin. They are laughing, they are smiling. Okay, let's see what's happening here. Suddenly the door burst open and a boy ran out, almost into his arms. He was a tall, handsome boy, and Mr. Craven gazed at him, unable to speak. Colin stood still and recovered his breath. Then he said, "Father, I'm Colin. You can't believe it, but it's true." He led his father into the garden and told him how the magic had made everything grow and had made him strong and well. Mr. Craven had never heard such a wonderful story. He sat by Mary and Dickon and the animals and laughed as he had not done for years. He was so proud of his handsome, healthy son. "Now," said Colin, "it needn't be a secret any more. I shall never need my chair again. I shall walk with you, father." They stood up and walked towards the house. At Mr. Craven's side, strong and straight as any lad in Warwickshire, walked his son.